Sometimes the things we inherit come when we need them most, though we're too broken to see their value. Chen stood outside the rusted gates of the old Kelvar Rope Works, holding an envelope from a lawyer he'd never met, about a great-uncle he barely remembered. The factory loomed against a gray Portland sky like a skeleton. 5 stories of brick and broken windows, surrounded by chain-link fence crowned with barbed wire. His son, Jamie, 8 years old, pressed against his leg. "Dad, is this ours now?" "I don't know, buddy," Marcus said quietly. The letter said he'd inherited the property. What it didn't say was what he was supposed to do with a condemned factory when he had $47 in his pocket and nowhere to sleep tonight except the shelter on Morrison Street. His daughter, Lily, 12, stood apart with her arms crossed, her face set in that expression she'd worn since her mother left 6 months ago, since Marcus lost his job at the tech firm, since everything fell apart. "It's a dump," she said flatly, "just like everything else." Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. Marcus wanted to argue, but she wasn't wrong. The Kelvar Rope Works had been closed since 1987, nearly 40 years of decay. The neighborhood around it had gone the same way. Empty warehouses, cracked pavement, the kind of industrial wasteland that city forgot about until developers decided it was worth gentrifying. But the letter from attorney Sarah Pemberton had been clear. His great-uncle Douglas Chen, whom Marcus had met exactly twice at family gatherings decades ago, had died at 94 and left him the factory property. No money, no explanation. Just 5 acres of contaminated industrial land and a building the city wanted demolished. "We should go," Lily said. "Shelter opened for dinner at 5. If we're late, we don't eat." She was right about that, too. The Morrison Street shelter had rules, and they'd learned them the hard way over the past 3 months. Check-in between 4 and 6. Lights out at 9. Out by 7 in the morning, rain or shine. It wasn't home. It was survival. But something made Marcus hesitate. The envelope had contained more than just the inheritance notice. There was a second piece of paper, yellowed and folded multiple times. He pulled it out now and read it again in the fading afternoon light. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I've passed on and you got in the factory. The family always said it was worthless. They were wrong. What your grandfather started still matters. The answers are in the rope. Find the old patterns, and you'll understand. Don't let them take it. Uncle Douglas." "The answers are in the rope?" Marcus murmured. "What did that mean?" Jamie tugged his jacket. "Can we go inside?" "Just a look." Marcus glanced at the padlock gate, then at the "No Trespassing, Property of Chen Estate" sign that someone had posted recently. Technically, that was him now. The Chen Estate. "Just for a few minutes," he said. The padlock was old, and the bolt cutters Marcus had borrowed from another shelter resident made quick work of it. He felt guilty about the theft. He'd return them tomorrow, but desperation had a way of rewriting the rules you thought you'd never break. The gate shrieked as it opened, and they stepped onto property Marcus technically owned but had no idea what to do with. The main building's entrance was boarded up, but Jamie found a side door with rotted wood that gave way easily. Inside, the factory was a cathedral of industrial decay. The ceiling stretched 20 feet overhead, supported by iron beams. Huge wooden spools, taller than Marcus, sat in rows like silent sentinels. Rusted machinery filled the floor space, equipment whose purpose Marcus couldn't begin to guess. And everywhere there was rope. Coils of it hung from the walls. Massive reels of it sat gathering dust. Different thicknesses, different materials. Hemp, manila, what looked like early synthetic fibers. Some of it had rotted away to nothing. Other coils looked almost preserved, protected somehow from the worst of the decay. "Whoa!" Jamie breathed, his earlier skepticism forgotten. He ran toward the nearest spool, which was easily 8 feet in diameter. "Don't touch anything," Marcus called, but it was too late. Jamie was already running his hands over the rope, tracing the patterns of the weave. Lily moved more carefully through the space, her phone out, using its flashlight to illuminate corners. "There's an office back here," she called, "with actual furniture." Marcus followed her voice to the back of the factory floor. A glass-walled office space still had its door intact. Inside was a desk, filing cabinets, and surprisingly, a chair that looked salvageable. Dust covered everything in a thick blanket, but the roof above this section had held, protecting the contents from the worst of the weather. "We could sleep here tonight," Lily said quietly. "It's dry, and it's ours, right? We own it." Marcus looked around the office. It was better than a shelter in some ways. Private, warm enough once they closed the door. Worse in others. No bathroom facilities, no running water, no heat except what they could generate. But it was theirs. That word felt strange in his mouth after months of owning nothing, of being allowed to exist in spaces only temporarily. Always at someone else's sufferance. "Just for tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we figure out what to do with this place." They made camp in the office. Marcus had kept their few possessions in his backpack. Changes of clothes, toiletries. The kids' school supplies that Lily still pretended to care about even though she'd stopped going weeks ago. Jamie pulled out his battered stuffed dinosaur, the one item from before that he refused to abandon. As darkness fell, they ate granola bars for dinner and used Marcus's phone flashlight to explore the filing cabinets. Most of the drawers were empty or filled with paperwork, so water damage had disintegrated at a touch. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, Marcus found something sealed in a metal box. The box was fireproof, waterproof, designed to survive. Inside were documents, photos, and a ledger book with Kelvar Rope Works, private records embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering. Marcus opened the ledger carefully. The entries dated back to 1942, written in precise handwriting he recognized from old letters. His grandfather's hand. Thomas Chen had founded the Kelvar Rope Works in 1941, just as America entered World War II. The first entries were straightforward. Orders for rope, deliveries, payments. The business seemed modest, supplying rope to shipping companies, fishing boats, small-scale industrial use. Nothing remarkable. But then, around mid-1943, the entries changed. New notations appeared marked with asterisks. Special order, Navy contract #4472, B, classified specifications, Bureau of Ships, prototype testing, Mare Island. The amounts next to these entries were substantial, far more than the regular business generated. And the descriptions were cryptic. Deep water anchor line, special weave, submarine netting, reinforced pattern, acoustic dampening cord, experimental. Dad. Jamie had curled up on the floor, using Marcus's jacket as a blanket. "Is this where Grandpa worked?" "Your great-great-grandfather," Marcus said. "My grandfather. He built this place during the war." "The big one?" Jamie asked. He was obsessed with World War II, could recite aircraft specifications and battle dates that Marcus had long forgotten. "Yeah, the big one." Marcus kept reading. The entries continued through 1944 and 1945, the Navy contracts growing larger and more cryptic. Then, in August 1945, right after the war ended, everything changed. There was a gap in the ledger, 3 weeks with no entries at all. Then, in September 1945, his grandfather had written, "Contract #4472 be completed. Final delivery to Mare Island. Navy inspector confirmed specifications exceeded. Payment pending final security review. Note, original design sealed per Navy directive. Secondary patents filed under civilian applications. Backup documentation stored in case of future dispute." And then, 3 months later, Navy payment delayed. Bureau of Ships claims contract pricing under dispute. Amount reduced from $8.2 million to $840,000. Protested through legal counsel. No response. December 1945. Marcus felt his chest tighten. His grandfather had been owed $8.2 million in 1945 dollars and had received only a tenth of that. That would be worth. He couldn't even calculate what that would be worth today with interest. He flipped forward through the ledger. His grandfather had continued the business, but the entries grew sparse and bitter. There were references to lawyers, to appeals, to letters sent to Navy Department that went unanswered. The business limped along on commercial rope sales, but the innovative work, the special contracts, those had dried up. By 1960, the entries were months apart. By 1970, the ledger ended entirely. Marcus looked up to find Lily watching him, her expression unreadable in the dim light from his phone. "What is it?" she asked. "I think Grandpa Thomas was cheated," Marcus said slowly. "By the Navy. During the war. They owed him millions and never paid. Can we get it back?" The question was so nakedly hopeful that it hurt. Marcus wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that this crumbling factory held some secret fortune that would solve everything. But he'd learned the hard way that hope was dangerous. "I don't know," he said honestly. "This was 80 years ago. The people involved are all dead. The money's long gone." "But Uncle Douglas's note," Lily pressed. "He said the answers are in the rope. He said don't let them take it." Marcus looked at the ledger entry again. Backup documentation stored in case of future dispute. Where would his grandfather have stored backup documentation? In this factory. Presumably, somewhere it would survive even if the business failed. Somewhere protected from weather, from thieves, from time itself. "Tomorrow," Marcus said, "tomorrow we search. But tonight we sleep." He took the first watch, sitting in the creaky office chair, while his children slept on the floor. Through the dirty windows, he could see the lights of Portland's skyline in the distance, glittering and indifferent. Somewhere in that city were people making million-dollar deals, living in penthouses, complaining about traffic from the comfort of their luxury cars. And here he was, a 36-year-old man with a Harvard engineering degree, sleeping in an abandoned factory with his children because the tech industry had decided he was too expensive to keep when the venture capital dried up, because his wife had decided poverty wasn't what she'd signed up for, because the safety net everyone assumed existed had holes big enough to fall through. But maybe, just maybe, his grandfather had left him more than a building full of rotted rope. Maybe somewhere in this factory was proof of what was owed, documentation that could change everything. Marcus pulled out Uncle Douglas's note again and read it by phone light. The answers are in the rope. Find the old patterns. Not in the ledgers. Not in the files. In the rope itself. He looked out at the factory floor, at the hundreds of coils and reels visible even in the darkness. Tomorrow he would start searching. Tomorrow he would figure out what his grandfather had hidden and why Uncle Douglas had thought it mattered enough to leave him this cryptic message. Tonight he would keep his children safe and warm in this small glass office, in this building that was theirs, on land that belonged to them. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, when you had nothing, something was everything. Marcus woke to gray dawn light filtering through the office windows, and the sound of Jamie's voice echoing through the factory floor. "Dad, Dad, come look at this." He jerked upright, his neck protesting from sleeping in the chair. Lily was already gone from her makeshift bed, her jacket missing. Marcus grabbed his phone and hurried out of the office, his heart racing with the particular fear that came from being responsible for children in an unsafe place. He found them 30 feet up on a metal catwalk that ran along the factory's upper level. Jamie was pointing at something on the wall, while Lily held on to his jacket to keep him from leaning too far over the railing. "Get down from there," Marcus called, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "But Dad, look." Jamie insisted. Marcus climbed the rusted ladder, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. The catwalk swayed slightly under his feet, but it held. When he reached his children, he saw what had caught Jamie's attention. The wall was covered in framed diagrams, technical drawings showing different rope weaving patterns. Each diagram was labeled with a date and specification number. But what made Marcus's breath catch was a notation on several of them. Classified. U.S. Navy contract #4472B. "These are the patterns," Marcus murmured, moving closer. The diagram showed intricate weaving techniques, different from standard rope construction. Numbers and measurements covered the margins, along with notes in his grandfather's handwriting about tensile strength, water resistance, and something called acoustic dampening coefficient. "What's acoustic dampening?" Lily asked. Marcus studied the diagram more carefully. "It means making something quieter, absorbing sound." He felt his pulse quicken. During World War II, submarines were vulnerable to sonar detection. If you could make a rope that dampened sound instead of transmitting it, You could make submarines quieter, Lily finished. She was smart, too smart sometimes. She'd inherited her mother's analytical mind, which meant she also saw through Marcus's hopeful statements to the disappointment usually waiting beneath them. But this felt different. These weren't just theoretical diagrams. These were actual Navy contract specifications, hanging on the wall of a factory that had manufactured the rope to implement them. "Help me photograph all of these," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. Every diagram, every label, every note. They worked systematically, documenting the 24 framed diagrams along the catwalk. As they worked, Marcus noticed something else. Small metal plaques beneath some frames with engraved text. Patent pending. Application #2 845 671. Filed April 1944. Patent pending. Application #2 901 for 38. Filed September 1944. Patent approved. U.S. Patent #2 934 552. Issued February 1948. His grandfather had patented the weaving techniques. That meant legal protection, documented ownership of the innovations. If the Navy had used these patterns in their submarines, in their ships, they would have owed royalties. For decades, Marcus's hands trembled as he photographed the patent numbers. This was more than just an unpaid invoice from 1945. This was ongoing intellectual property theft. If his grandfather's patents had been used without compensation. "Dad," Jamie said, pulling on a sleeve, "there's words carved in the wall here." Marcus followed his son's pointing finger to where the brick wall met the catwalk railing. Someone had etched letters into mortar between bricks. Crude but deliberate. The rope remembers what men forget. TC 1961. Thomas Chen, his grandfather. 1961. 16 years after the war ended. 37 years after he'd founded the factory. What had he meant? The answers are in the rope. Marcus repeated Uncle Douglas's words. Not just the patterns. The rope itself. He looked out over the factory floor at the hundreds of coils and reels. Somewhere in all that rotted hemp and manila and early synthetic fiber was what? Documentation hidden inside the rope? Evidence woven into the patterns themselves? "We need to examine the rope," he said. "Systematically, starting with the oldest stuff we can find." They climbed down from the catwalk and began searching the factory floor. Most of the rope was too degraded to be useful. Decades of moisture and temperature swings had turned it brittle or moldy. But in the far corner of the building, Marcus found a section that had been better protected. The roof was intact here, and the walls showed signs of having been sealed at some point, creating a more climate-controlled environment. Inside this section were wooden crates, stacked and labeled with careful handwriting. Marcus pried open the first one and found rope reels packed in what looked like wax canvas, preserved against moisture. The label on the reel read, Navy Contract #4472B, Prototype Series. Do not discard, July 1944. "Lily, bring the ledger," Marcus called. "I need to cross-reference these dates." While Lily ran back to the office, Marcus carefully unwound a section of the rope. It was different from modern rope. Thicker, with a complex weave pattern that his fingers could trace, but his eyes struggled to follow. The fibers were hemp, but treated with something that made them stiff and slightly waxy. He held a section up to the morning light, filtering through the high windows. The weave pattern was definitely the same as one of the diagrams on the wall, a specific over-under-through technique that created a dense, almost solid structure. And then he saw it. Between the outer strands, wound into the core of the rope itself, was something that caught the light differently. Something metallic. Marcus's heart hammered as he carefully separated the strands. Woven into the center of the rope, protected by layers of treated hemp, was a thin metal tube. It was sealed at both ends, no bigger around than a pencil, maybe 6 inches long. "What is that?" Lily had returned with the ledger, her voice sharp with curiosity. "I don't know." Marcus worked the tube free from the rope's core. It was surprisingly light, made of what looked like aluminum or some alloy. One end had a threaded cap. His hands shook as he unscrewed it. Inside was a rolled piece of paper, protected from moisture and time by the metal tube, by the wax rope, by the sealed crates and protected corner of the factory. Marcus unrolled it carefully. It was a contract, not the original, a certified copy stamped with official Navy seals. Contract hashtag 4472 be between the United States Navy Bureau ships and Kelvar Rope Works. Signed October 15, 1943. Marcus scanned the terms, his engineering background helping him parse the technical specifications. The Navy had contracted for the development and production of specialized acoustic dampening rope for submarine and naval vessel applications. The development phase was worth $840,000. The production phase, contingent on successful testing, was worth $8.2 million for delivery of 500,000 linear feet of rope meeting specified acoustic performance standards. And there, at the bottom of the contract, was a clause that made Marcus's breath stop. Upon successful completion production phase and delivery of materials meeting or exceeding specifications, contractors shall retain rights to all associated patents and manufacturing processes. Navy shall have perpetual license for military applications. Any civilian or commercial applications of said patents shall remain property of contractor with standard royalty arrangements for third-party licensing. His grandfather had retained the patent rights. The Navy had a military license, but Thomas Chen owned the innovations, which meant if anyone else had used those weaving techniques, those acoustic dampening methods, they would have owed royalties to the Chen family. For 80 years, Marcus sat down hard on a crate, the contract trembling in his hands. Lily, check the patent numbers from the diagrams upstairs. Look them up online. See if you can find out if they're still active or if anyone's been using them. While Lily worked on her phone, Marcus carefully opened more crates. Each reel of rope from the Navy contract series had a metal tube woven into its core. He extracted 5 more, finding a second contract copy, identical to the first aid detailed accounting ledger showing every delivery made under contract hashtag 4472B, with Navy inspector signatures confirming acceptance a letter from the Bureau of Ships dated April 1945, acknowledging that all delivered materials had exceeded specifications in acoustic damping performance by 23 to 47% across all test scenarios, a memo from his grandfather's lawyer dated 1947, outlining the dispute over payment, and noting that the Navy had unilaterally reduced the contract value despite documented performance exceeding requirements. A list of additional Navy contracts from 1946 to 1952 that appeared to use similar specifications without payment to Kelvar Rope Works. Dad. Lily's voice was strange, tight with something Marcus couldn't identify. The patents are still active. Sort of. What do you mean, sort of? They were renewed in 1968, and again in 1988 and 2008. Someone's been keeping them current. But she turned her phone screen toward him. They're not listed under Chen or Kelvar Rope Works. They're owned by something called Maritime Defense Solutions, LLC. Marcus felt cold. Someone stole the patents. Or bought them. Maybe Grandpa sold them. But Marcus was already shaking his head. Pulling out the ledger from the metal box, he flipped to the entries from the 1960s, looking for any reference to a sale or transfer. There, March 1961. Received notice from Navy JAG office. Patents related to contract hashtag 4472 be being disputed. MDS Corp claiming prior invention. Legal counsel retained. This is theft. June 1961. MDS lawsuit proceeding. They have Navy backing. Cannot afford extended legal battle. Factory revenues insufficient. December 1961. Lost patent dispute. Court ruled in favor of MDS. Judge accepted Navy testimony that specifications originated from military research, not civilian contractor innovation. Patents transferred to MDS ownership. Everything we built, stolen. And then the entry that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. The rope remembers what men forget. I've hidden the proof. The truth is woven into every reel. Someday, someone will find it. Someday, they'll understand what was stolen. TC, they stole it, Marcus said quietly. The Navy and this MDS corporation. They took Grandpa's innovations, his patents, everything. And then they buried him in legal fees until he couldn't fight anymore. Jamie had been playing with a length of rope, but now he looked up, his 8-year-old face serious. Are they going to try to steal from us too? The question hung in the dusty air. Marcus looked at his children. Lily with her guarded expression that hid how much she still hoped for things to get better. Jamie with his dinosaur still clutched in one hand. Both of them wearing clothes from the donation bin at the shelter, because Marcus couldn't afford to buy them new ones. They had nothing. They'd already lost everything. Their home, their stability, their belief that the world was fair or that hard work mattered. But now they had something worth stealing. Documentation of fraud, evidence of intellectual property theft, proof of contracts fulfilled and payments withheld, and if those patents were still generating revenue for maritime defense solutions, if the acoustic dampening techniques his grandfather had invented were still being used. Not this time, Marcus said. This time we fight. The office door of Morrison Street legal aid smelled like old coffee and desperation. Marcus had called ahead, explaining he needed help with military contract dispute and possible patent theft. The receptionist had sounded skeptical, but had given him an appointment with a junior attorney named Rebecca Tran. Rebecca was young, maybe 28, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she was either overworked or underpaid. Probably both. She listened to Marcus's story with increasing attention, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Let me make sure I understand, she said when he finished. Your grandfather fulfilled a Navy contract in 1945, was underpaid by $7.4 million, had his patent stolen through a rigged lawsuit in 1961, and you found hidden documentation proving all of this? Yes. And you're currently homeless, living in a factory building with your 2 children? Marcus's face heated with shame, but he nodded. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, her pen tapping against her notepad. Do you know what Maritime Defense Solutions does now? I looked them up this morning. They're a major defense contractor. Submarine systems, naval equipment. Revenue last year was about $3.2 billion. They're not going to take kindly to accusations of intellectual property theft going back 80 years. I know. They'll have lawyers who cost more per hour than I make in a week. They'll bury us in motions and delays. They'll argue statute of limitations, chain of custody, that your grandfather signed away right somewhere in paperwork you can't prove he didn't sign. I know, Marcus repeated. But the contract I found says clearly that he retained patent rights. And I can prove the patents are still active, still generating revenue, and still registered to a company that obtained them through fraud. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. Why come to legal aid? Why not go to a big firm that works on contingency? Because big firms want guaranteed wins. I'm a homeless man with kids, living in a condemned building, claiming my dead grandfather was cheated by the military. I'm not exactly an attractive client. No, Rebecca agreed. You're not. She set down her pen. But this case, if even half of what you're saying is true, this could be enormous. Not just for you. There are probably hundreds of small contractors who got cheated by the military during and after World War II. Men who invented things, created innovations, and had them stolen by companies with better lawyers and government connections. She pulled out a fresh legal pad. I'm going to need copies of everything. The contracts, the patent numbers, the accounting ledgers, the correspondence, everything you found hidden in that rope. I can bring it all tomorrow. No. Rebecca's voice was firm. You bring it today. Right now. Because if Maritime Defense Solutions gets wind that you found this documentation, they're going to move to suppress it. They'll claim it's stolen property, that you're trespassing the factory, that the evidence is inadmissible. We need to get everything documented and filed with the court before they know what's happening. Marcus felt the first real surge of hope he'd experienced in months. You're taking the case? I'm insane for taking this case, Rebecca corrected. But yes, my grandfather was Chinese-American too. He fought in World War II, came home to a country that wouldn't let him buy a house in the neighborhood he wanted because of his race. I know what it's like when the system is rigged against you. She stood up. Go get those documents. I'll start drafting a preservation order to make sure nothing in that factory can be destroyed or removed. Marcus hurried back to the factory, his mind racing. Lily and Jamie had stayed behind, continuing to search through crates and extract the metal tubes hidden in rope reels. By the time Marcus returned, they'd found 12 more tubes containing various documents, more contract copies, more accounting records, and crucially, a complete set of patent applications in his grandfather's handwriting filed months before the Navy lawsuit. "This is huge," Rebecca said when Marcus spread everything out on her desk. "These patent applications prove your grandfather was the original inventor. The applications date to 1944, 2 years before Maritime Defense Solutions claims they developed the technology." She photographed everything, made copies, and began drafting legal documents with speed that suggested she'd been preparing for a case like this her entire career. "What are our chances?" Marcus asked. "Honestly, maybe 20%. The system is designed to protect established companies, especially defense contractors with government relationships. But," she looked up from her laptop, "but we have something they don't." "What?" "The actual truth, documented, hidden away for 80 years, waiting for someone to find it." Rebecca smiled grimly. "And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough." Marcus wanted to believe her, but as he walked back to the factory that evening, past the shelter where they should be checking in for dinner, past the businesses closing for the day while people headed home to warm houses and full refrigerators, he felt a familiar weight of reality settling back onto his shoulders. They were fighting a $3.2 billion corporation with evidence hidden in rope and the help of an overworked legal aid attorney. The odds weren't 20%. They were worse. But what choice did he have? Go back to the shelter, pretend the factory was worthless, let his children believe that nothing ever worked out and the world was fundamentally unfair, or fight, knowing they'd probably lose, but at least try to reclaim what had been stolen from his family? At the factory, Lily had set up a makeshift classroom in the office, using books in the library to continue Jamie's education. She looked up when Marcus entered. "Did the lawyer take the case?" "She did." "What happens now?" Marcus sat down in the creaky chair, exhausted from a day of revelation and hope and crushing awareness of how the world actually worked. "Now we wait. We let the lawyers do their work. And we keep searching the factory, because the more evidence we find, the better our chances. And if we lose?" Lily's voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus heard the fear underneath. "Then we tried," he said. "Then we stood up for what was right. And that matters, even if we don't win." Lily didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. She just went back to helping Jamie with his math homework. Her face set in that expression that meant she was preparing for disappointment. Marcus pulled out the ledger and read through his grandfather's entries again, looking for anything he'd missed. And there, near the end of the entries from 1961, he found something new. "If anyone finds this, know that I fought. I didn't have enough money or enough power, but I fought. The rope remembers. The patterns prove the truth. Don't let them bury it again." The contract was worth $8.2 million in 1945, with interest and royalties. "They owe our family everything. Make them pay." Thomas Chen, December 1961. Everything. Marcus looked around the office, at his sleeping children, at the factory that was legally his but practically worthless, at the documents that proved a debt that might never be paid. Everything. He didn't know if they could win, but his grandfather had told him to make them pay. So he would try. Outside, rain began to fall on Portland's industrial district, drumming on the factory roof like 1,000 fingers tapping, waiting, reminded him that time was running and powerful people were already moving against him, even if they didn't know it yet. The rope remembered. Now Marcus had to make sure the world remembered too. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after Marcus filed his legal claim. He returned to the factory from the library, where they'd been using computers and bathrooms during the day, to find a black Mercedes SUV parked outside the gates. A man in an expensive suit stood talking to someone on his phone, his back to Marcus. "Stay behind me," Marcus told the kids quietly. The man turned as they approached. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Chen, I'm Richard Voss, General Counsel for Maritime Defense Solutions." He extended his hand. Marcus didn't take it. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Actually, that's debatable. Voss's smile didn't waver. The city has condemned this building. There's an outstanding demolition order. Technically, you're the one trespassing, living here with your children in violation of about a dozen safety codes. I own this property. You inherited a contaminated industrial site with environmental remediation costs exceeding its value. The city wants it demolished. MDS has offered to handle the demolition and clean up at no cost to you, and we're prepared to purchase the land for $150,000. That's more than generous, Mr. Chen. Marcus felt Lily tense beside him. $150,000 would change their lives. It would mean an apartment, stability, a chance to rebuild. What about the patents? Marcus asked. The ones your company stole from my grandfather? Voss's expression hardened slightly. That's a serious accusation. I'd be careful about making defamatory statements, especially in front of your children. It's only defamation if it's false. The patents in question were legally transferred to MDS in 1961 after a court found that the underlying technology originated from naval research, not civilian innovation. Your grandfather lost that case. The matter is settled. The matter was rigged, Marcus said, his voice harder than he'd intended. My grandfather couldn't afford to fight. Your company had Navy backing. The judge ruled based on perjured testimony. That's quite a claim. Voss pulled out a document folder. This is a copy of the 1961 court ruling. You'll note that your grandfather was represented by counsel, had the opportunity to present evidence, and lost on the merits. The patents were legitimately transferred. Marcus didn't take the folder. He hid documentation proving the truth. Contracts signed before the Navy claimed prior invention. Patent applications filed in 1944, years before your company says they developed the technology. Something flickered across Voss's face. Surprise, maybe, or concern. I'm not aware of any such documentation. If it exists and wasn't presented in the original case, one has to wonder why. Because he knew the system was rigged. He knew you'd find a way to suppress it or claim it was forged. So he hid it for 80 years. And now I've found it. Voss was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus with new attention. Mr. Chen, let me be direct. MDS is a $3.2 billion company with extensive government contracts. We have legal resources that could tie you up in court for decades. Even if you had some evidence, and I'm not conceding that you do, you'd never survive the legal battle. You're living in a condemned building with 2 children. Do you really want to drag them through years of litigation you can't possibly win? That sounds like a threat. It's a reality check. Voss's voice softened slightly. Look, I understand you're in a difficult situation. $150,000 could make a real difference for your family. Take the offer. Walk away. Give your kids some stability. Marcus looked down at Jamie, who was gripping his hand tightly, and at Lily, whose face showed that careful blankness she wore when she was trying not to hope for something. $150,000. It was real money, life-changing money. But his grandfather's words echoed in his mind. They owe our family everything. Make them pay. The answer is no, Marcus said. This property isn't for sale. Not for $150,000. Not for any amount until the patent theft is addressed. Voss's professional mask slipped slightly. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. After Voss left, Marcus felt his hand shaking. Lily watched him with those 2 old eyes. That was a lot of money, she said quietly. It was. Are you sure you did the right thing? Marcus honestly didn't know, but he said, your great-great-grandfather built something valuable. They stole it. If we take their money now, we're saying that's okay. That it's fine to cheat people if you wait long enough. But what if we lose everything fighting them? We've already lost everything, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice gentle. We're living in an abandoned factory. We have nothing left to lose except our self-respect. Lily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went to help Jamie, who was trying to catalog the rope reels they'd searched. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Voss's visit, the veiled threats, the very real possibility that he just turned down his children's best chance at stability for a principle that might not matter in the real world. At 2 a.m., he gave up on sleep and started going through more of the factory's crates. In a corner he hadn't searched yet, he found newer boxes from the 1980s based on the labels. These must have been added by Uncle Douglas, who'd apparently maintained the factory even after the business closed. Inside the first box was a thick folder marked Naval Contract Accounting, ongoing use 1961 to 1987. Marcus's heart hammered as he opened it. What he found was a meticulous accounting of every U.S. Navy submarine built between 1961 and 1987 that had used rope manufactured according to his grandfather's patented acoustic dampening specifications. Uncle Douglas had tracked it all: class of submarine, date of commission, approximate linear footage of rope installed, estimated value based on the original contract pricing. At the bottom of the ledger was a total that made Marcus's breath catch. Estimated rope usage 1961 to 1987. 4.2 million linear feet contract value per specifications. $16.40 per linear foot total value. $68,880,000 plus interest. 6% annually, $347,340,000. $347 million. Just for the submarines built through 1987. That didn't include surface ships, didn't include the decades since then, didn't include commercial applications of the patents. Marcus flipped to the next page and found a letter Uncle Douglas had written but apparently never sent. To whom it may concern, I am Douglas Chen, nephew of Thomas Chen, founder of Kelvar Rope Works. Since my uncle's death in 1973, I have maintained records of the U.S. Navy's continued use of rope manufacturing techniques patented by Thomas Chen and fraudulently transferred to Maritime Defense Solutions in 1961. The Navy and MDS have built and equipped 127 submarines using these specifications without paying royalties to the Chen family. Based on the original contract terms, the debt owed to our family now exceeds $300 million. I have attempted to contact Navy procurement offices and MDS legal counsel. My letters go unanswered. My calls are not returned. It is clear that both the government and the corporation benefit from maintaining the fiction that Thomas Chen's innovations were not his own. I am now 74 years old and in poor health. I will not live to see this injustice corrected, but I am preserving all documentation in the hope that someday someone in our family will have the resources and determination to fight this battle. The rope remembers what men forget. The truth is woven into every specification, every contract, every submarine that runs quieter because of what Thomas Chen invented. Don't let them bury it. Make them pay. Douglas Chen, June 1986. Marcus sat back, the letter trembling in his hands. Uncle Douglas had known. He'd tracked everything, documented everything, kept the factory standing and the evidence preserved for 40 years after his uncle's death, waiting for someone to find it and finish the fight. And now it had fallen to Marcus, a homeless single father with negative net worth and 2 children sleeping on the floor of a condemned factory. The universe had a sick sense of humor, but the documentation was undeniable. $347 million through 1987. How much more had accumulated in the decade since? How many more submarines? How many surface vessels? How many commercial applications of the acoustic dampening technology? Marcus pulled out his phone and called Rebecca Tran, not caring that it was 3 a.m. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. This better be important. How much would interest compound on $347 million over 37 years? Rebecca was silent for a moment. What are you talking about? Marcus explained what he'd found. Uncle Douglas's accounting. The meticulous records of every submarine. The calculated debt through 1987. Jesus, Rebecca breathed. If the original debt was that high, and we calculate compound interest from 1987 to now, we're talking about $445 million. Maybe more, depending on how we argue the interest rate. For $145 million, Marcus repeated numbly, plus ongoing royalties for any current use of the patents. MDS's submarine division alone probably generates $200 million annually. If even a fraction of that is based on your grandfather's innovations. She trailed off. Marcus, This isn't just about correcting a historical injustice. This is potentially the largest intellectual property theft case in naval history, which means they'll fight even harder to bury it. Yes, Rebecca's voice hardened, which is why we need to move fast. I'm filing an emergency motion tomorrow morning to freeze MDS's patent assets related to your grandfather's innovations. We're also requesting a forensic accounting of all Navy contracts using the specifications. And we're going to alert the press, because the only way to fight a company this big is to make the case too public to suppress. They offered me $150,000 to walk away. Of course they did. They're terrified. They know if this goes to trial, if the documentation you found becomes public record, their entire submarine division could be compromised. Defense contracts could be reevaluated. They'd owe hundreds of millions in back royalties, possibly face criminal charges for fraud. Marcus thought about Richard Voss's smile, his casual threats. They're not going to let this go to trial. No, Rebecca agreed. They're going to try to make you go away, one way or another. The next morning, Marcus found out what one way or another meant. He woke to pounding on the factory door and a voice shouting, "City building inspector, open up." Marcus scrambled to his feet, telling the kids to stay in the office. He opened the door to find 3 men in city uniforms and 2 police officers. "Marcus, Chen," the lead inspector said, checking a clipboard. "This building has been condemned as structurally unsafe and environmentally hazardous. You have 2 hours to vacate the premises. After that, you'll be subject to arrest for trespassing. I own this property. That doesn't give you the right to occupy a condemned structure, especially with minors present." The inspector handed him a document. "Child Protective Services has been notified. You either vacate voluntarily with your children, or they'll be removed and placed in protective custody while we process you for child endangerment." Marcus felt his world tilting. They were threatening to take his kids. "You can't do this. I have legal claim to this property. You have ownership of land, not a license to occupy a building that violates about 50 safety codes." The inspector's voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "Look, Mr. Chun, I've got kids too. I understand you're in a tough spot, but this building isn't safe. The structural engineer's report shows compromised support beams, asbestos in the insulation, potential chemical contamination in the soil. You can't live here with children." One of the police officers stepped forward. "There's a family shelter in southeast Portland that can take all 3 of you tonight. It's a better situation than this." Marcus looked back at the office, where Lily was watching to the glass wall, her face pale. She was holding Jamie, who looked terrified. "Can I at least secure my personal property? I have documents stored here." The inspector checked his watch. "You've got 2 hours. After that, the building is sealed pending demolition." As soon as they left, Marcus called Rebecca. "They're forcing you out," she said immediately. "MDS must have called in favors at the city. This is exactly what I was worried about. What do I do? They're threatening to take my kids." "Go to the shelter. Get your children safe. But first, get every document out of that factory. Every contract, every ledger, every piece of evidence. Put it somewhere secure where MDS can't get to it." Marcus spent the next hour in a frantic blur, pulling documents from hiding places, photographing rope reels and their hidden tubes, gathering everything that proved his grandfather's case. Lily and Jamie helped silently, their faces showing they understood this was the end of their brief period of having something that was theirs. Marcus made 3 trips to a storage unit he rented with money he couldn't afford to spend, securing boxes of documents, the metal tubes, samples of the original rope. By the time he locked the storage unit, he had 15 minutes before the city inspectors would return. Back at the factory, he took one last look around. This building had been his grandfather's dream, his uncle's obsession, and for 3 strange weeks, his own refuge. Now it would be demolished, turned into condos or a tech campus, and no one would remember that Thomas Chun had invented something here that changed naval warfare. Unless Marcus could prove it. "Dad," Lily said quietly, "we need to go." The shelter in southeast Portland was cleaner than Morrison Street, but more crowded. They had a single room with 3 cots. shared bathroom facilities, and rules posted on every wall. Dinner was served at 5 p.m. Lights out at 10 p.m. No exceptions. Jamie cried himself to sleep that first night, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Lily lay rigid on her cot, staring at the ceiling. Marcus sat up, listening to his children's breathing and feeling like the world's biggest failure. He'd turned down $150,000 for a principal. Now they were back in a shelter. His kids were traumatized, and MDS had successfully forced him out of the one piece of property they owned. His phone buzzed with text from Rebecca. Filing went through. We have a hearing date in 3 weeks. But you should see this. She sent a link to a news article. The headline read, "Defense contractor denies patent theft claims, calls allegations baseless and opportunistic." Marcus read through the article, his jaw clenching. MDS had gotten ahead of the story, painting him as a desperate man making wild accusations to extort money from a legitimate business. They quoted Richard Voss. Mr. Chen is exploiting his family's tragic circumstances to make unfounded claims about contracts settled legally 60 years ago. We sympathize with the situation, but sympathy doesn't create legal rights to our intellectual property. The comments section was brutal. People calling Marcus a scammer, saying he was using his kids as props, suggesting he should get a job instead of filing frivolous lawsuits. Only one comment stood out. My grandfather worked at Kelvar Rope Works during the war. He always said Thomas Chen was a genius who got screwed by the government. Maybe someone should finally listen. J. Martinez. Marcus screenshot the comment and sent it to Rebecca. Maybe, just maybe, there were other witnesses out there, other people who remembered. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered, "Mr. Chen?" A woman's voice, older, careful. "My name is Dr. Sarah Blackwell. I'm a professor of naval history at Reed College. I saw the news coverage about your case, and I think I might have information that could help you." Marcus sat up straighter. "What kind of information?" "I've been researching World War II naval innovations for the past 20 years. I have extensive documentation on submarine technology development, including acoustic dampening systems. Your grandfather's name appears in several classified documents that were declassified in the 1990s. Documents that suggest his innovations were much more significant than the official record indicates. Can you testify to that?" "I can do better than testify. I can provide documentary evidence from naval archives that prove Thomas Chen's work was the foundation for acoustic dampening technology still used today. And I can show that the Navy knew it, documented it internally, and then helped MDS steal it." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. "Why are you helping me?" Dr. Blackwell was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm a historian. I believe in documenting the truth, not the convenient narrative. And because my mother was Japanese-American. She spent World War II in an internment camp while your grandfather was helping the Navy win the war. The least I can do is make sure his contribution is recognized." "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't thank me yet. This fight is going to get uglier before it's over. MDS has billions of dollars at stake. They're not going to surrender quietly." After the call ended, Marcus walked to the shelter's common area, where Lily sat reading a library book, using it to avoid talking to the other shelter residents. "We might have a chance," he told her quietly. She looked up, her expression guarded. "How many times have you said that, Dad? How many times has it not worked out?" "This is different. It's always different. Until it's the same." She returned to her book. "I'm tired of hoping. It just hurts more when it doesn't happen." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to convince her that this time was real. But he couldn't, because she was right. Hope had betrayed them over and over. When he'd lost his job, when her mother left, when every job application went unanswered, when the eviction notice came. Why should this be different? But as he lay on his cot that night, listening to Jamie's quiet breathing and Lily's restless shifting, Marcus thought about his grandfather. Thomas Chen had hope too, had built a business, invented something revolutionary, believed the system would reward innovation and hard work. And the system had crushed him, but he'd kept fighting. He'd hidden the evidence. He'd passed it to Douglas, who'd maintained it for 40 more years. 2 generations of hope, a belief that someday justice would matter. Now it was Marcus's turn to carry that hope, not for himself. He'd learned that hoping for himself only led to disappointment, but for his grandfather, who died believing he'd been forgotten, for Uncle Douglas, who'd spent his last years preserving evidence no one seemed to want, for his children, who needed to see that sometimes the good guys won, even when the odds were impossible. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at the photo he'd taken of his grandfather's last ledger entry. Make them pay. "I'm trying, Grandpa," he whispered to the darkness. "God help me, I'm trying." In 3 weeks, they'd go to court. MDS would bring their expensive lawyers, their expert witnesses, their narrative about frivolous lawsuits and baseless claims. Marcus would bring rope hidden in storage units, documents extracted from metal tubes, and the testimony of an elderly historian who believed in truth. It wasn't much, but his grandfather had hidden the evidence because he believed it would be enough. Now Marcus had to prove he was right. The courtroom was packed. Marcus had expected a quiet hearing in some administrative office, but Rebecca had been right about making this public. News cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled half the gallery. And sitting in the front row were faces Marcus hadn't expected to see. J. Martinez, the commenter from a news article, alongside 3 other elderly men who'd worked at Kelvar Rope Works during the war. "They found me," Martinez whispered as Marcus passed. Said they wanted to make sure someone told the truth about Thomas Chen. Across the aisle, Maritime Defense Solutions had brought an army, 6 attorneys in expensive suits, a team of paralegals with file boxes, and Richard Voss looking confident and prepared. Judge Margaret Harrison entered, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from either side. She reviewed her notes for a long moment before speaking. "This is a highly unusual case. We're being asked to revisit intellectual property decisions made 60 years ago, examine military contracts from World War II, and potentially assign liability for damages exceeding $400 million. Mr. Chen, your attorney has made some extraordinary claims. I hope you're prepared to support them." Rebecca stood, her voice clear and professional despite the bags under her eyes from 3 weeks of 18-hour days. "Your Honor, we are... The evidence will show a systematic theft of intellectual property, facilitated by the U.S. Navy and perpetuated by Maritime Defense Solutions for 8 decades. We're not asking the court to rewrite history. We're asking it to acknowledge what the historical record actually shows." She called her first witness, Dr. Sarah Blackwell. The professor was in her 70s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying herself with the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime studying truth. She took the stand and began methodically dismantling MDS's version of history. "I've examined naval archives declassified between 1993 and 2008, Dr. Blackwell testified. These documents show that Thomas Chen's acoustic dampening rope was considered revolutionary by Navy engineers. Internal memos from 1944 described his weaving techniques as unlike anything previously developed and essential to submarine stealth capabilities. She presented document after document, Navy memos praising Chen's innovations, engineering reports crediting his techniques, procurement records showing the Navy had continued ordering rope to his specifications for decades after the war. This memo from 1958, Dr. Blackwell held up a page, explicitly states that Chen's patents were the foundation of current acoustic dampening systems and recommends that the Navy secure permanent access to the technology to avoid ongoing licensing costs. And how did they secure that access? Rebecca asked, by backing Maritime Defense Solutions in a lawsuit designed to strip Thomas Chen of his patent rights. There's a letter here from a Navy JAG attorney to MDS counsel, dated 1960, discussing strategies for transferring commercially valuable patents from civilian contractors to defense-aligned corporations. The MDS attorneys erupted in objections, hearsay, relevance, improper authentication. Judge Harrison sustained some and overruled others, but allowed the documents into evidence. The pattern is clear, Dr. Blackwell continued. Thomas Chen invented something valuable. The Navy wanted permanent access without ongoing costs. MDS wanted the commercial rights. Together, They engineered a legal proceeding that stripped Chen of his patents while making it appear legitimate. When the MDS attorneys cross-examined, they went after her credibility hard. Wasn't she selectively interpreting documents? Couldn't the memos be understood differently? How could she claim to know the intent behind decisions made 60 years ago? But Dr. Blackwell held firm. I'm a historian. I read documents in context. And the context here is unmistakable. A pattern of powerful institutions collaborating to steal from a small businessman who lacked the resources to fight back. Rebecca's next witness was J. Martinez, now 87, who'd worked at Kelvar Rope Works as a teenager during the war. Thomas Chen was meticulous, Martinez testified, his voice quavering but certain. Every rope we made had to meet exact specifications. He'd test them himself, check the weave, measure the acoustic dampening. The Navy inspectors would come, and they'd always be impressed. I remember one of them saying, "This is the best work we've seen from any contractor." Mr. Chen was proud of that. Did you see evidence that the Navy was developing similar technology independently? Rebecca asked. No, ma'am. The Navy guys would ask Mr. Chen questions about the weaving techniques, about the fiber treatment. They were learning from him, not teaching him. The other Kelvar workers corroborated Martinez's testimony. By the time Rebecca rested her case, she'd built a narrative that was hard to dismiss. Thomas Chen as an innovative genius, systematically exploited by institutions that should have protected him. Then it was MDS's turn. Their lead attorney, a man named Caldwell who probably cost $800 an hour, stood with practiced confidence. Your Honor, this is a tragic case of a family believing their own mythology. Thomas Chen was a competent rope manufacturer who did good work during the war, but the acoustic dampening technology wasn't his innovation. It was developed by Navy engineers at Mare Island, and Chen was contracted to manufacture rope according to their specifications. He called his own expert witness, a retired Navy engineer named Admiral Peterson, who testified that acoustic dampening research had been ongoing at multiple naval facilities throughout the war. It's impossible to attribute the innovation to any single contractor, Peterson said. Many people contributed to the development of submarine stealth technology. But when Rebecca cross-examined, she produced the patent applications Thomas Chen had filed in 1944, detailed technical drawings, mathematical calculations for acoustic dampening coefficients, weaving patterns that matched exactly what was later used in naval specifications. Admiral Peterson, do these look like the work of someone manufacturing according to someone else's specifications, or the work of an inventor developing original technology? Peterson studied the documents, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. These are quite sophisticated, more sophisticated than what the Navy was developing independently in 1944. I can't speak to what the Navy was developing in 1944, but you can speak to what's in front of you. And what's in front of you is original technical innovation by Thomas Chen, filed months before the Navy claims to have developed similar technology. Isn't that correct? The patents were ultimately awarded to MDS after a lawsuit in 1961, but the applications were filed by Thomas Chen in 1944. Yes or no, Admiral? Yes. Rebecca let that sit for a moment before continuing. How many U.S. submarines built since 1961 have used acoustic dampening rope manufactured to these specifications? I don't have exact numbers. Approximately? Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Most submarines built in the last 60 years use some form of acoustic dampening rope. Yes. Based on Thomas Chen's innovations? Based on technology that was refined based on the foundational patents filed by Thomas Chen in 1944. Yes or no? The technology has evolved. Your Honor. Rebecca turned to Judge Harrison. I'd like to enter into evidence a technical analysis prepared by MIT's Department of Naval Engineering. It compares Thomas Chen's 1944 patent applications to the specifications used in modern submarine construction. The analysis concludes that current technology is substantially similar in fundamental approach and technique to Chen's original innovations. She handed copies to the judge and to MDS's attorneys. Caldwell's face tightened as he read. Rebecca pressed on. The question before this court isn't whether submarine technology has advanced in 80 years. Of course it has. The question is whether the foundational innovations were stolen from Thomas Chen and whether his heirs are entitled to compensation for the ongoing use of his patents. She pulled out Uncle Douglas's accounting ledger. Between 1961 and 1987, the U.S. Navy built 127 submarines using rope manufactured to Thomas Chen's specifications. Uncle Douglas Chen tracked every single one. At the contract rate established in 1945, adjusted only for inflation, the value of rope supplied under those specifications was $347 million. She let that number hang in the air, but we're not claiming based only on past use. MDS's current submarine division generates approximately $200 million in annual revenue. A significant portion of that revenue derives from acoustic dampening systems based on Thomas Chen's foundational patents. If we calculate compound interest from 1961 to present, factor in ongoing royalties, and include civilian applications of the patents that MDS has licensed to other companies, the total debt owed to the Chen family is $445 million. The courtroom erupted, reporters typing frantically, the MDS attorneys conferring in urgent whispers, Judge Harrison gaveling for order. For $145 million, the judge repeated. That's your claim. It's a conservative claim, Your Honor. We could argue for more based on punitive damages for fraud, but we're focused on actual compensation for patent use. Caldwell stood quickly. Your Honor, this is absurd. Even if we accepted every claim the plaintiff makes, which we don't, there are statutes of limitation on fraud claims. You can't sue for damages from the 1960s in 2026. Unless the fraud is ongoing, Rebecca countered. MDS is still using patents. They're still generating revenue from Thomas Chen's innovations. The statute of limitations doesn't run on ongoing intellectual property theft. Judge Harrison held up her hand. I'll hear arguments on statute of limitations. But first, Mr. Caldwell, I want to address the underlying question. Do you dispute that Thomas Chen filed patent applications in 1944 for acoustic dampening rope techniques? The applications were filed, but do you dispute that those patents were transferred to MDS in 1961? They were legally transferred through. Do you dispute that MDS has generated revenue from those patents since 1961? Caldwell was quiet for a moment. The patents have been part of MDS's intellectual property portfolio, yes. And has MDS ever paid royalties to Chen family for the use of those patents? The patents were legally transferred. No royalties were required, because a court in 1961 ruled that the patents weren't Thomas Chen's innovations in the first place. Correct. Based on testimony from Navy officials who claimed the technology was developed independently. Yes. Judge Harrison picked up Dr. Blackwell's evidence, testimony that appears to have been contradicted by the Navy's own internal documents, which explicitly credit Thomas Chen with the innovations. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Those documents are being taken out of context. Then provide the context. Show me Navy documents from 1943 or 1944 showing independent development of acoustic dampening rope technology. Show me patent applications filed by Navy engineers before Thomas Chen's applications. Show me anything that supports the claim made in the 1961 lawsuit. The MDS legal team scrambled, but they had nothing. The narrative they'd maintained for 60 years was crumbling under the weight of actual documentary evidence. Judge Harrison called a recess. Marcus stepped outside the courtroom on shaking legs. Lily and Jamie had been sitting in the gallery. Rebecca had argued that the family should be visible, should remind the judge that real people were affected by this case. Did we win? Jamie asked. I don't know, buddy. The judge hasn't decided yet. But Lily, who'd been silent through most of the testimony, said quietly, we won something. People heard the truth. Whatever happens now, Grandpa's story is real. It's not just family mythology anymore. Marcus pulled her into a hug, feeling her thin shoulders shake slightly. She'd been protecting herself against hope for so long, and now hope was forcing its way back in whether she wanted it or not. Rebecca found them in the hallway. The judge wants to see both sides in chambers. This is unusual, but I think she's considering a settlement conference. What does that mean? It means MDS knows they're going to lose if this goes to a full trial. They want to negotiate. In Judge Harrison's chambers, Richard Voss sat with his legal team, looking significantly less confident than he had 3 weeks ago. The judge got straight to the point. I've reviewed the evidence. Mr. Caldwell, your client's position is untenable. The documentary evidence clearly shows Thomas Chen developed the acoustic dampening technology, filed the patents, and was subsequently stripped of them through a legal proceeding that appears to have relied on, at best, misleading testimony from Navy officials. Your Honor, even if there were irregularities in the 1961 proceeding. Irregularities? Judge Harrison's voice was sharp. The Navy's own internal documents contradict the testimony given in that case. That's not an irregularity. That's perjury. She turned to Rebecca. Ms. Tran, your damages calculation seems supported by the evidence, though I have concerns about the compound interest formula. But before we get into the mathematics, I want to know if your client is open to settlement discussions. Rebecca looked at Marcus. They'd talked about this, about the possibility that MDS would offer money to make this go away quietly, about whether Marcus would take it. Marcus thought about his grandfather, spending his final years bitter and defeated, believing he'd been forgotten, about Uncle Douglas, maintaining a factory and hiding evidence for decades because he believed the truth mattered, about Lily's guarded expression, and Jamie's confused questions about why bad people sometimes won. What are they offering? Marcus asked. Voss cleared his throat. We're prepared to offer $25 million. Full settlement, complete release of all claims, confidential terms. It was an absurd amount of money. Life-changing. Generational wealth. Marcus could buy a house, send his kids to college, never worry about money again. But it was less than 6% of what was actually owed. No, Marcus said. Voss blinked. Mr. Chen, $25 million is 18% of what you owe for documented submarine use through 1987 alone. It doesn't include interest, doesn't include ongoing royalties, doesn't include the civilian applications you've licensed to other companies. And it comes with a confidentiality clause that would prevent me from ever talking about how you stole from my grandfather. Be reasonable. I am being reasonable. You built $1 billion division on technology you stole. You profited for 80 years from my grandfather's work. $25 million is insulting. Judge Harrison watched this exchange with interest. What would you accept, Mr. Chen? Marcus looked at Rebecca, who nodded slightly. They discussed this too. Full payment of documented debt through 1987. That's $347 million with compound interest at 6%, which comes to approximately $445 million, plus ongoing royalties at standard patent licensing rates. 5% of revenue from any products using the Chen patents. No confidentiality clause. Public acknowledgement that Thomas Chen was the original inventor of the acoustic dampening technology, and his name on the patents. Voss's face went red. That's impossible. We can't. Then we go to trial, Marcus said calmly. And when we win, not if, when, the judgment will include punitive damages. We'll argue treble damages for knowing fraud. We'll argue you should forfeit every dollar you've made from the stolen patents. And it won't be confidential. It'll be public record that Maritime Defense Solutions built its entire submarine division on stolen technology. The room was silent. Judge Harrison tapped her pen against her desk. Mr. Voss, I'm going to be blunt. The documentary evidence is damning. If this goes to trial, you will lose. The only questions are how much you'll lose and how much damage the public disclosure will do to your company's reputation and government contracts. I suggest you seriously consider Mr. Chen's terms. After MDS's team left consult with their board, Rebecca turned to Marcus with something like awe. You just turned down $25 million. My grandfather died thinking he'd failed. Uncle Douglas spent 40 years preserving evidence nobody wanted. I'm not settling for a fraction of what's owed just because the real number is uncomfortable for them. They might not agree to your terms. Then we go to trial. You said we'd win. I said we'd probably win. There's always risk. Marcus thought about the past 3 months. Losing everything. Living in shelters. Watching his children lose faith in the idea that the world could be fair. He'd already lost everything that mattered except his family. Some things are worth the risk, he said. The negotiation took 3 days. MDS's board balked the full amount. Tried to negotiate down. Threatened to drag the case through appeals for years. But Judge Harrison made it clear that she'd rule from the bench if they didn't settle, and her ruling would likely be worse for them than Marcus's terms. Finally, on a Thursday afternoon, Rebecca called Marcus with the news. They've agreed. $445 million in back payment and interest. 5% ongoing royalties from the submarine division. Public acknowledgement. Thomas Chen's name restored to the patents. And they're funding a scholarship program in his name at the Naval Academy. Marcus had to sit down. The shelter's common room suddenly felt too small, too bright. They agreed to everything? Everything. The money will be paid in installments, $200 million within 30 days. The rest over 5 years to protect their cash flow. But it's legally binding. You won, Marcus. Your family won. That evening, Marcus sat with his children in their small shelter room and tried to explain what had happened. We're going to have money? Jamie asked, his 8-year-old brain struggling with the concept. Yes, buddy, a lot of money. Enough for a house? Enough for a house and for college, and for pretty much anything we'll ever need. Lily was quieter, her face showing that careful blankness that meant she was feeling too much to show it. Is it real? They're actually paying us. It's real. The judge made it official today. She was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly Marcus almost didn't hear it. Grandpa would be happy. Marcus pulled both his children close. Yeah, I think he would be. But the real moment of reckoning came the next morning, when Marcus stood outside the Kelvar Rope Works one last time. The city had postponed the demolition pending the settlement, and now the factory belonged to Marcus again. Not as a condemned liability, but as a historical site he could choose to preserve or develop. He walked through the silent building, past the rope spools and rusted machinery, to the glass-walled office where they'd slept those first desperate nights. Uncle Douglas's note still sat on the desk. The answers are in the rope. The answers had been there, hidden in metal tubes, woven into patents, preserved in documents and photographs, and his grandfather's meticulous record-keeping. The rope had remembered what men had tried to forget. His phone rang. It was a reporter from the Portland Tribune, asking for an interview about the biggest patent theft case in naval history. Then the Washington Post called. Then NPR. The story was spreading, not just about the money, but about what it represented. A small businessman cheated by powerful institutions, his family fighting for 3 generations to reclaim what was stolen. It was the kind of story people wanted to believe in, evidence that sometimes the system could be forced to deliver justice, even when that justice came 80 years late. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible stories like this one. Over the next 6 months, Marcus's life transformed in ways he'd never imagined. The first installment of the settlement, $200 million, cleared in early December. Marcus bought a house first, a real house with enough bedrooms for everyone and a yard where Jamie could play. Lily got her own room, which she filled with books and art supplies, and slowly, carefully, began to treat as a permanent space instead of somewhere temporary she'd be forced to leave. He hired a financial advisor, set up trust funds for the kids, established the Thomas Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund that would help engineering students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He donated to the shelters that had housed them, to legal aid organizations that helped people like Rebecca fight impossible cases. And he restored the Kelvar Rope Works. Not as a factory. The building was too old, the industrial uses too outdated, but as a museum and community center. He worked with Dr. Blackwell to create exhibits documenting Thomas Chen's innovations, the World War II effort, and the long fight for justice. The rope reels were preserved behind glass, along with the patent diagrams and Uncle Douglas's meticulous accounting ledgers. The grand opening was in June, nearly a year after Marcus had first stood outside the rusted gates with nothing but a letter from a dead uncle. The ceremony drew hundreds of people, veterans groups, engineering students, former Kelvar workers, and reporters from across the country. Jay Martinez, now 88, cut the ribbon alongside Marcus. Thomas would be proud, the old man said, his eyes damp. He always said the truth would come out eventually. Just took longer than he hoped. Admiral Peterson attended too, looking uncomfortable but present. He'd left MDS after the settlement, citing ethical concerns about leadership that had perpetuated the fraud. He approached Marcus privately. "I testified against your family," he said bluntly. "I believe what I was told about the patent development. I didn't question it because it was easier to accept the official narrative. I'm sorry for that." Marcus had spent months being angry at Peterson, at the Navy officials who'd lied, at everyone who'd been part of stealing from his grandfather. But standing in the restored factory, seeing Thomas Chen's name finally recognized, he found the anger had transformed into something else. "You told the truth when it mattered," Marcus said. "On the stand, when Rebecca pushed you, you acknowledged what the evidence showed. That took courage." Peterson nodded, relief visible in his face. "Your grandfather was brilliant. The Navy should have honored that instead of stealing from him." The museum became a success beyond what Marcus had imagined. School groups toured regularly. Engineering programs used the exhibits to teach about innovation and intellectual property. And most importantly, people learned Thomas Chen's name, understood his contribution, recognized that sometimes the heroes aren't the ones in the official histories, but the quiet innovators whose work gets stolen and buried. Lily thrived in stability. She returned to school, caught up quickly despite her months away, and discovered a talent for engineering that made Marcus wonder if Thomas Chen's genius had skipped a few generations only to reemerge in his great-great-granddaughter. By her freshman year of high school, she was designing her own acoustic dampening systems, improving on her great-great-grandfather's innovations. Jamie grew out of the fearful quietness that had marked his sheltered days. He joined Little League, made friends, stopped clutching his stuffed dinosaur like a lifeline, but he kept it on his shelf, a reminder of when they'd had nothing except each other. And Marcus found purpose he'd never expected. He became an advocate for small inventors, using his platform and resources to help others fight patent theft and corporate exploitation. He testified before Congress about the need to protect individual innovators from institutional power. He funded legal aid programs and established a fellowship for attorneys willing to take on impossible cases. 2 years after the settlement, Rebecca Tran joined his foundation as general counsel. She burned out at legal aid after the Chen case. Too many fights and too little support. But working for Marcus, she could choose cases based on merit rather than funding, could fight the battles that matter without worrying about billable hours. "You know what the best part is?" she said one afternoon as they reviewed grant applications from inventors seeking help. "We're not just correcting your grandfather's story. We're preventing it from happening to others. We're changing the system that allowed the theft in the first place." Marcus looked around his office in the restored factory, Thomas Chen's old workspace, now filled with computers and files documenting ongoing cases. Through the window, he could see the museum floor where school children were examining the rope reels, learning about acoustic dampening, hearing the story of a man who'd invented something revolutionary and had it stolen, but whose family never stopped fighting for the truth. "The rope remembers," Marcus said quietly, repeating his grandfather's words. "We just had to be willing to listen." 3 years after inheriting a condemned factory, Marcus Chen stood on the dock at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the same facility where his grandfather had delivered rope in 1945. The Navy was commissioning a new submarine, the USS Thomas Chen, named in honor of the man whose innovations had helped America win World War II and had shaped submarine stealth technology for 3 generations. Marcus stood with Lily and Jamie, watching the ceremony. The submarine's captain approached them after the official events, offering his hand. "Your great-great-grandfather's work is still protecting sailors today," he said. "Every submarine we build uses principles he developed. We owe him a debt we can never fully repay." "You're paying it now," Marcus said, looking at the submarine bearing Thomas Chen's name. "By remembering. by making sure his story isn't forgotten. That night, back in Portland, Marcus sat in the quiet of his home office, a real office in a real house, so different from the condemned factory where this journey had begun. He pulled out the metal box he'd found that first day, the one containing his grandfather's ledgers and Uncle Douglas's note. He added his own letter to the collection. To whoever comes after me, you're reading this because our family has always believed in documenting the truth, in preserving evidence, in fighting for what's right even when the odds seem impossible. Thomas Chen invented something that changed the world. They stole it from him, buried his name, tried to erase his contribution, but he hid the proof. Uncle Douglas preserved it, and I fought to reclaim it. We won, not just money, though the settlement was $445 million. We won recognition, acknowledgement, the restoration of truth. We proved that sometimes, eventually, justice prevails. But it took 3 generations of stubbornness, 80 years of patience, and a lot of luck. The system isn't designed to deliver justice to people like us. We had to fight for every inch. If you're reading this, if you're facing your own impossible fight, know this. The truth matters. Evidence matters. Persistence matters. Don't let them bury it. Don't let them make you believe that power always wins. The rope remembers what men forget. Keep fighting. Marcus Chen, July 2028. He sealed the letter in a new metal box and placed it in the museum's archives, next to his grandfather's original documents. Someday, maybe, another Chen would need to know that their family's history was one of fighting impossible battles and occasionally, miraculously, winning them. Outside his window, Portland's lights glittered against the night sky. Somewhere in those lights were other families fighting their own battles, other small inventors being crushed by corporate power, other people who needed to know that the system could be challenged. Marcus couldn't fight every battle, but he could fight some. He could use his resources, his platform, his grandfather's vindicated legacy to make sure that at least a few more stories ended with justice instead of defeat. The rope had remembered. The truth had survived. Justice, delayed for 80 years, had finally arrived. And Marcus Chen, who'd once been a homeless father sleeping in an abandoned factory with his children, was now the custodian of his family's legacy and the champion of countless others still fighting for theirs. Some inheritances come with nothing but rust and debt. But some come with truth woven into rope, evidence hidden in metal tubes, and the stubborn belief that justice, no matter how long delayed, is always worth fighting for. Thomas Chen had believed that. Uncle Douglas had preserved it, and Marcus had proven it true. 5 years after the settlement, Marcus Chen sat in the boardroom of the Chen Family Foundation, reviewing grant applications. The foundation now had an endowment of $180 million, money Marcus had set aside from the settlement specifically to help others fight battles like his grandfather's. Across the table sat Rebecca Tran, now the foundation's chief legal officer, and Dr. Sarah Blackwell, who joined as director of historical research. Together, they reviewed cases of small inventors, independent contractors, and families who've been exploited by corporations or government entities. "This one's interesting," Rebecca said, sliding a folder across the table. A woman in Tennessee whose grandmother invented a textile treatment process in the 1950s. The patent was transferred to a chemical company under questionable circumstances. The company's now worth $400 million, and the family never received a dime. Marcus opened the folder and felt the familiar tug of recognition. It was his grandfather's story all over again. Innovation stolen. Patents transferred through legal maneuvering. A family left with nothing while others profited for generations. "Fund it," he said. "Full legal support. And let's see if Dr. Blackwell can find historical documentation like she found for us." Dr. Blackwell smiled. "I've already started looking. There's a beautiful archive at the University of Tennessee that might have what we need." This had become their pattern. Rebecca handled the legal strategy. Dr. Blackwell uncovered historical evidence, and Marcus provided the resources and public platform to make sure these cases got attention. In 5 years, they'd helped recover $127 million for families who'd been cheated, corrected the historical record on dozens of inventions, and forced 3 major corporations to acknowledge intellectual property theft. They didn't win Every case. Some were too old, the evidence too degraded, the statute of limitations too clear. But they won enough, and more importantly, they changed the conversation about how the powerful exploit the powerless. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Lily. Dad, got accepted to MIT. Full scholarship to the Naval engineering program. They said my acoustic dampening research impressed the selection committee. He felt tears prick his eyes. MIT, where his grandfather had dreamed of sending his own children, but never had the money. Where the acoustic dampening technology Thomas Chen had invented was now taught as foundational to modern submarine design. And now his great-great-granddaughter would study there, building on a legacy that had almost been erased. He texted back, Grandpa Thomas would be so proud. I know I am. The museum had expanded too. What started as a single building had grown into a campus. The original Kelvar Rope Works factory remained the centerpiece, but Marcus had acquired the surrounding properties and built additional structures. A research center where students could study historical patents and innovations, a legal clinic where inventors could get free advice, and a memorial garden honoring small innovators whose contributions had been stolen or forgotten. The garden's centerpiece was a bronze statue of Thomas Chen, holding a length of rope, his face captured in the moment of invention. The inscription read, Thomas Chen, 1919 to 1973, inventor, patriot. Father, his innovation protected those who serve, his persistence protected the truth, his legacy protects those who create. Visitors left flowers at the statue's base. Veterans who'd served on submarines came to pay respects to the man whose work had kept them safe. Engineering students touched the bronze rope for luck before exams. And families fighting their own battles against corporate theft came seeking inspiration. One afternoon, an elderly Japanese-American woman approached Marcus in the museum. She was in her 90s, moving slowly but with purpose. Mr. Chen, my name is Grace Yamamoto. I need to tell you something about your grandfather. Marcus led her to a quiet bench. Please sit. What would you like to tell me? Grace's hands trembled as she pulled out a yellowed photograph. It showed Thomas Chen standing with a young Japanese-American woman outside the factory. Both were smiling, holding a certificate. That's me, Grace said, pointing to the young woman. 1946. I'd just been released from the Manzanar internment camp. I had a degree in chemistry, but no one would hire me. Too many people still saw us as the enemy, even after the war ended. She touched the photograph gently. Your grandfather hired me. First job I could find. He said he didn't care where my family came from. He cared whether I could help him improve his rope treatments. He paid me the same wage he paid the white chemist, which was unheard of. Marcus felt his throat tighten. I didn't know that. He never talked about it. That was his way. He just did what was right without needing recognition. Grace looked up at Marcus with tears in her eyes. When I heard about your court case, about how they'd stolen from him, I wanted to testify, but I was too sick to travel. I'm glad you won. Thomas Chen deserved better than what this country gave him. Did you stay in touch with him after you left the factory? Grace nodded. Until he died. I went on to work for a pharmaceutical company, had a good career, but I never forgot that he gave me a chance when no one else would. She handed Marcus the photograph. I wanted you to have this. And I wanted you to know that your grandfather's legacy isn't just the inventions. It's the people he helped, the dignity he showed others, the way he believed in doing right even when the world wasn't watching. After Grace left, Marcus added the photograph to the museum's collection, but he also added it to his own office wall, a reminder that his grandfather's story was larger than patents and court cases. It was about the kind of man Thomas Chen had been, the values he'd lived by, and the example he'd set. Jamie, now 13, had become the museum's unofficial junior curator. He gave tours to school groups, explaining the rope-weaving techniques with an enthusiasm that reminded Marcus of the 8-year-old who'd first climbed the factory catwalk and discovered the patent diagrams. This is the original prototype rope. Jamie would explain, pointing to the glass case. My great-great-grandpa made this in 1944. See how the weave pattern is different? That's what made it absorb sound instead of transmitting it. That's what made our submarines quieter than the enemy's. The kids on the tours would press close to the glass, fascinated. And sometimes their teachers would tell them that Jamie used to be homeless, that his family had lived in this building when it was condemned and falling apart, that the story of the Chen family was proof that perseverance mattered. Marcus worried sometimes that the pressure of being the Chen family would be too much for his children. But Lily and Jamie seemed to carry it lightly, understanding that they'd been given opportunities because of their great-great-grandfather's genius and their father's determination, and that those gifts came with responsibility. Lily's acoustic dampening research was already generating interest from defense contractors. The same companies that had profited from Thomas Chen's stolen work now wanted to license innovations from his great-great-granddaughter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "I'm going to patent everything," Lily told Marcus over dinner one night. "Every innovation, every improvement. And I'm going to make damn sure no one steals it." Language, Marcus said automatically, but he was smiling. "Dad, I'm 17. I can say damn." "Fair enough. And yes, patent everything. Learn from your great-great-grandfather's experience." "I am," Lily said seriously. "That's why I'm also documenting everything. Every experiment, every calculation, every design choice. I'm creating a paper trail so comprehensive that no one can ever claim they invented it independently." She pulled out her laptop and showed Marcus her research journal. Hundreds of pages of meticulous notes, all time-stamped and backed up to multiple cloud services. "If someone tries to steal this 70 years from now, my great-great-grandchildren will have all the evidence they need." Marcus laughed, but he felt a surge of pride. The Chen family had learned. They would never be caught unprepared again. The Foundation's work expanded internationally. They helped a Filipino engineer recover royalties from a circuit board design that had been stolen by a Taiwanese manufacturer. They assisted an Indian software developer prove that a major tech company had appropriated his code. They supported a Mexican inventor fighting a U.S. corporation over agricultural equipment patents. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same. Someone with talent but without power, facing institutions designed to protect the powerful. And each time a foundation helped secure a victory, Marcus thought about his grandfather, about how one small business owner's stolen innovations had created a foundation that now protected hundreds of others. Dr. Blackwell published a book, The Rope That Remembered: Innovation, Theft, and Justice in the American Military-Industrial Complex. It became required reading in engineering ethics courses and law schools. The book told Thomas Chen's story, but also the stories of dozens of other inventors who'd been exploited, creating a comprehensive history of how innovation was stolen from the powerless and credited to the powerful. The book's dedication read, "For Thomas Chen, Douglas Chen, and Marcus Chen, 3 generations who proved that truth, however long buried, eventually rises." Rebecca used the book's research to push for legislative changes. She testified before Congress, advocating for stronger protections for independent inventors, longer periods for challenging fraudulent patent transfers, and greater penalties for corporations found guilty of intellectual property theft. Some of the laws passed, others didn't, but the conversation changed. Companies became more cautious about stealing from small inventors, knowing that the Chen Foundation might fund the legal fight, that Dr. Blackwell might uncover historical evidence, that Rebecca Tran might turn it into a national news story. On the 10th anniversary of the settlement, the Navy held a special ceremony at the Kelvar Rope Works Museum. They were donating a section of actual rope from the USS Thomas Chen, the submarine named after Marcus's grandfather, to be displayed permanently in the museum. The Secretary of the Navy spoke at the ceremony. Thomas Chen's innovations helped America win World War II and protected sailors throughout the Cold War and beyond. The acoustic dampening techniques he developed are still used today. We regret that his contributions were not properly recognized during his lifetime, but we're honored to acknowledge them now. Marcus stood on the stage beside the secretary, looking out at the crowd. Veterans in uniform, engineering students, inventors who'd been helped by the foundation, reporters documenting the event. And there, in the front row, were the people who mattered most: Lily, home from MIT for the ceremony, and Jamie, now 14 and already talking about studying naval architecture. After the speeches, after the rope section was installed in its climate control case, After the crowds dispersed, Marcus stood alone in the museum. Evening light filtered to the high windows, illuminating the rope reels and patent diagrams. The exhibits document his grandfather's genius and Uncle Douglas's persistence. He thought about the journey, from standing outside rusted gates with $47 in his pocket and nowhere to sleep, to this moment, surrounded by evidence that justice, however delayed, could still arrive. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Chen, my name is David Okonkwo. I'm calling from Lagos, Nigeria. My grandfather invented a water purification system in 1967 that was stolen by a European engineering firm. I read Dr. Blackwell's book. I saw what your foundation did for other families. I was wondering." Marcus smiled. "Tell me about your grandfather's invention." And he listened, taking notes, already planning how the foundation could help, how Dr. Blackwell could search Nigerian archives, how Rebecca could build the legal case. Because this was a legacy now, not just recovering what had been stolen from Thomas Chen, but using that victory to help others, not just correcting one injustice, but creating a system to prevent and remedy thousands more. The rope had remembered. The Chen family had fought. And now they would make sure that other families, other inventors, other quiet geniuses whose work was stolen in the dark would have someone fighting for them too. Marcus looked up at his grandfather's statue through the window, at Thomas Chen holding that length of rope, frozen in bronze for all time. "We're still fighting, Grandpa," Marcus said quietly. "We'll always be fighting, because you taught us that some battles are worth it, no matter the cost." The bronze Thomas Chen didn't answer. But in the evening light, with shadows playing across the statue's face, Marcus could almost see him smile. The truth had been buried for 80 years. It had taken 3 generations to uncover it. But once uncovered, once vindicated, it had become a tool to uncover other truths, to vindicate other forgotten innovators. The rope remembered what men forgot, and the Chen family would make sure the world never forgot again. 20 years after Marcus first stood outside the rusted gates of Kelvar Rope Works, he returned to the place where everything had changed. The museum was closed for the evening, staff gone home, lights dimmed in the exhibits. But Marcus had his key, would always have his key. This building was more than a museum now. It was a monument to stubbornness, to belief in truth, to the idea that justice delayed wasn't justice denied if someone was willing to fight long enough. He walked slowly to the main gallery, past the rope reels preserved behind glass, past the patent diagrams on the walls, past the interactive exhibits where children could try weaving patterns and learn about acoustic dampening. The museum had hosted over 2 million visitors in 20 years. 2 million people who'd learned Thomas Chen's name, understood his contribution, recognized that history wasn't always written by the winners. Sometimes it was rewritten by the persistent. In the center of the gallery stood the original metal tubes Marcus had extracted from rope reels that desperate first week. They were displayed like artifacts from an archaeological dig, which, in a way, they were. Each tube was labeled with what it had contained. Contract #4472B. Original copy, patent applications, file 1944. Thomas Chen's final letter to his descendants. Marcus paused his grandfather's letter, reading words he'd memorized 2 decades ago. Make them pay. They had. The foundation Marcus established had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. The original $180 million endowment had grown to $340 million through careful investment and additional donations from inventors they'd helped, from veterans who wanted to honor Thomas Chen's legacy, from corporations trying to atone for their own exploitive histories. In 20 years, the Chen Family Foundation had recovered $1.8 billion in stolen intellectual property for 347 families across 23 countries. They'd changed patent laws in 6 states. They'd helped establish international treaties protecting independent inventors. And they created a network of legal clinics, historical researchers, and advocacy organizations dedicated to making sure small innovators couldn't be crushed by institutional power. But the numbers didn't capture what mattered most. The numbers didn't show the elderly woman in Ohio who cried when she learned her father's agricultural invention would finally be credited to him 40 years after his death. They They didn't show the young engineer in Kenya, who could now afford to send his children to university because his stolen software code had been restored to him. They didn't show the families who believed they were powerless, discovering that sometimes, with the right help, power could be challenged. Marcus climbed the metal catwalk to the upper level where the patent diagram still hung. Someone had added new frames over the years. Patents filed by Lily, now Dr. Lillian Chen, whose acoustic dampening research had surpassed her great-great-grandfather's original innovations. Her patents were displayed beside Thomas's, a visual representation of legacy building on legacy. Lily was 32 now, a professor at MIT, married to another engineer, expecting her first child. She'd named her unborn daughter Grace, after Grace Yamamoto, the woman Thomas had hired when no one else would. So she remembers Lily had told Marcus that the Chen family legacy isn't just about what we invented, it's about how we treated people. Jamie, at 28, had become a documentary filmmaker. His first major film, The Rope Remembers, told Thomas Chen's story but also featured a dozen other families fighting for recognition of stolen innovations. The film had won awards, been shown in schools, sparked congressional hearings about reforming the patent system. Both of his children had taken the lesson Marcus had learned in that condemned factory and amplified it, spread it, turned one family's victory into a movement. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca, now 62, but still running the Foundation's legal department with the same fierce determination she'd shown as an overworked legal aid attorney. Victory in the Gonzalez case. Patent rights restored. $23 million settlement. Family weeping with joy. This never gets old. No, it didn't. Marcus smiled and texted back. Grandpa would approve. He descended the catwalk and walked to the section of the museum dedicated to Uncle Douglas. There were photographs of the old man at various ages. Always alone, always working on the factory, always preserving evidence that no one seemed to want. Marcus had felt guilty for years that Douglas had died before seeing the vindication, before knowing his 40 years of maintenance and documentation had mattered. But then Jamie had found something while researching for his documentary, a journal Douglas had kept during his final year. The last entry, written 2 weeks before he died, read, "Marcus is the right one. He has children, which means he has reason to fight beyond pride. He's desperate enough to look closely and smart enough to understand what he finds. The rope will speak to him. The truth will survive. I can rest now, knowing I pass a burden to someone who can finish it." Uncle Douglas had known. He'd chosen Marcus deliberately, understanding that a desperate man with children would be more motivated than a comfortable one. He'd waited until Marcus had nothing left to lose, then given him everything he needed to win. It was manipulation, in a way. But it was also faith. Faith that Marcus would be worthy of the inheritance, that he would understand what mattered, that he would fight. And Marcus had. He reached the memorial garden, stepping outside into the cool evening air. The bronze statue of Thomas Chen gleamed in the landscape lighting. Over the years, the garden had expanded to include other figures. Uncle Douglas standing beside Thomas, both of them holding rope, both of them looking forward, as if watching for someone to carry on their work. And there, added just last year, was a statue of Marcus himself. He'd protested his inclusion, but the foundation board and his children had overruled him. "You're part of the story now, Dad," Lily had said. 3 generations fighting the same battle. That matters. The statue showed Marcus as he'd been that first day, 36 years old, worn down by life, holding a letter in one hand and a child's hand in the other. The inscription read, "Marcus Chen, 1990. Who finished where his grandfather started, who turned vindication into legacy, who proved that truth survives." The date of death was blank, waiting. Marcus was 56 now, in good health, planning to work for at least another decade. But seeing his statue beside his grandfather's and uncle's felt like standing at his own funeral, hearing what people would say when he was gone. It was uncomfortable and humbling and strangely motivating. He had maybe 20 more good years. What would he do with them? Marcus sat on the bench facing the 3 statues. He thought about the journey, from homeless desperation to this moment, sitting in a garden that bore his family's name, surrounded by evidence that their fight had mattered. The The $445 million settlement had been paid in full 15 years ago. The ongoing royalties still generated $8 to $12 million annually, all of it funneled into the foundation. MDS had restructured after the scandal. Several executives had resigned, and they'd established their own ethics program to prevent future intellectual property theft. They weren't villains anymore, just a company trying to do better after being caught doing wrong. The Navy had fully embraced Thomas Chen's legacy. Every submarine commander graduating from a naval academy learned his story. The USS Thomas Chen was still in active service, one of the quietest submarines in the fleet, and the Navy had commissioned a second ship bearing the Chen name, a research vessel dedicated to developing new technologies while ensuring inventors were properly credited and compensated. But the real victory wasn't the money or the recognition. It was a shift in how people thought about innovation and exploitation. Before the Chen case, most people assumed that intellectual property theft was just how business worked. The powerful took from the powerless, and that was a natural order. After the Chen case, after the publicity, after Dr. Blackwell's book and Jamie's documentary, and the Foundation's string of victories, people began to question that assumption. Maybe it didn't have to be that way. Maybe small inventors deserve protection. Maybe the system could be changed. It was slow change, incremental change. But it was real. Marcus's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. This was his quiet time, his evening to reflect. But the caller ID showed Lily, and he always answered for his children. Dad, the baby's coming. We're heading to the hospital now. Marcus's heart leaped. I'm on my way. He stood, looking one more time at the three bronze figures. His grandfather, who'd invented something revolutionary and had it stolen. His uncle, who preserved the truth for 40 years. And himself, who'd fought the battle and won. Now a fourth generation was arriving. Grace Chen, who would grow up in a world slightly more just than the one her great-great-great-grandfather had known, slightly more willing to protect innovators, slightly more likely to challenge the powerful. Not perfect, not fair, but better. And that was what legacy meant. Not achieving perfection, but making things better. Not winning every fight, but winning enough that the next generation had an easier path. Marcus drove to the hospital, his mind full of thoughts about what he'd tell his granddaughter someday. Would he tell her about living in a condemned factory? About searching through rope reels for hidden evidence? About standing in a courtroom and demanding justice from people who thought they were untouchable? Yes, he'd tell her all of it. But he'd also tell her what mattered more, that her great-great-great-grandfather had been brilliant and kind, that he'd hired people others wouldn't give a chance, that he created beauty and function in the rope he wove. That Uncle Douglas had been stubborn and patient, preserving truth because he believed it mattered even when no one else seemed to care. That her grandfather Marcus had learned that fighting for principle was worth it, even when the odds seemed impossible. At the hospital, Lily was in labor, her husband beside her, looking terrified and excited in equal measure. Marcus sat in the waiting room with Jamie, who was filming everything because that's what he did. He documented, he preserved, he made sure stories weren't forgotten. Dad, Jamie said during a quiet moment, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd taken that first offer? The $150,000. Marcus had thought about that question often over the years. $150,000 would have changed their lives. They had been comfortable, stable. Lily and Jamie wouldn't have spent that terrifying year fighting, watching their father go to war against a billion-dollar corporation. We'd have been better off financially in the short term, Marcus said honestly. But we had been worse off in every other way. We'd have known we sold out, that we took money to stay quiet about theft. We had watched MDS keep profiting from Grandpa's work, and known we could have stopped it, but chose comfort instead. No regrets. 1,000 regrets about everything I did wrong as a father, every mistake I made. But fighting for the truth? No, that's the one thing I got right. 12 hours later, Grace Chen was born, 7 pounds, 6 ounces, healthy and loud and perfect. Marcus held her in his arms and felt the weight of generations, the accumulation of fights fought and victories won and truths preserved. Welcome to the Chen family, he whispered to her. We've got a hell of a story to tell you. He thought about the rope, about his grandfather's words carved into factory walls. The rope remembers what men forget. The rope had remembered. Through 80 years of silence, through deliberate burial of truth, through powerful people trying to erase the historical record, the rope had remembered. The evidence had survived. The truth had waited. And when the time came, when someone was finally desperate enough and determined enough to look, the rope had spoken. Marcus looked down at his granddaughter, at this new life carrying the Chen name forward into a future he couldn't imagine. What would her world be like? Would she face the same battles, the same exploitation, the same powerful people crushing the powerless? Probably. The world didn't change that fast. But she'd have advantages her great-great-great-grandfather never had. She'd have the Chen Foundation fighting for justice. She'd have laws that had been changed because of her family's battle. She'd have a network of advocates and attorneys and historians dedicated to protecting innovators. She'd have proof that sometimes, if you fought hard enough and long enough and believed deeply enough in truth, you could win. She'd have the rope's memory, preserved and honored and turned into a weapon against exploitation. And she'd have her family's story, not as a tragedy, but as a victory. Not as a cautionary tale about how the powerful always win, but as evidence that sometimes they don't. Marcus kissed his granddaughter's forehead and handed her back to Lily. She's going to change the world, Lily said, exhausted and radiant. Probably, Marcus agreed. But first, let's just let her sleep. Outside the hospital window, dawn was breaking over Portland. The city was waking up. People heading to jobs, to schools, to lives that had nothing to do with intellectual property theft or battles for justice. Normal people, living normal lives, unaware that the system that governed their world was slightly more just than it had been 20 years ago because one homeless man had refused to give up. Marcus thought about going home, about sleeping after the long night. But instead, he drove back to the museum, to the factory where it had all begun. He stood in the center of the main gallery, surrounded by rope and patents and evidence and truth. The rope reels sat silent in their cases, no longer hiding secrets, their stories told and preserved and honored. But Marcus understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. The rope hadn't just remembered his grandfather's innovations, his uncle's persistence, his own desperate fight. The rope remembered what it meant to be human, to create, to struggle, to be exploited, to resist, to fight back, to win against impossible odds, to turn personal victory into systematic change, to build a legacy that protected others. The rope remembered that truth mattered, that justice mattered, that one person fighting for what was right could change the world. Thomas Chen had woven that truth into every fiber. Uncle Douglas had preserved it. Marcus had vindicated it. And now Grace Chen would carry it forward into a future where the rope's memory would continue to speak, continue to challenge power, continue to insist that innovation deserved protection and truth deserved recognition. The rope remembers what men forget. And the Chen family would make sure the world kept remembering, generation after generation, fight after fight, victory after victory. Because some legacies weren't measured in patents or money. They were measured in truth preserved, in justice delivered, in the stubborn belief that right would triumph if someone was willing to fight for it. Marcus locked the museum and walked into the morning light. His granddaughter was sleeping peacefully in the hospital. His grandfather's name was carved in bronze. The rope's memory lived on. And somewhere Marcus liked to think, Thomas Chen was finally at rest, knowing that his fight hadn't been in vain, that his innovations had been recognized, that his family had finished what he started. The answers had been in the rope all along. It had just taken 3 generations to learn how to listen,